morning sun poured through the tall glass windows of the downtown building, spilling gold across the polished lobby. Inside the cafeteria, the sound of trays clattering and voices overlapping filled the room. In the middle of it all sat Grace, her posture straight, her lunch neatly arranged in a small plastic container that had seen years of use. She wore a plain beige skirt, a simple white blouse, and carried the same canvas tote she always did. Nothing about her outfit turned heads. And yet, somehow, she still drew them. A group from marketing swept in, heels clicking sharply against the tile. Samantha, tall and polished, slowed her steps when she spotted Grace sitting alone. She let her voice carry just enough to hook attention. "Would you look at that," she said, her smile cutting thin. "Brings her food from home, dresses like a school teacher, and still thinks she belongs here." Laughter bubbled up immediately, her friends leaning in, giggling like it was a performance staged just for them. Lisa, her phone always in hand, tilted it toward Grace's lunch. "Who even uses Tupperware anymore?" she whispered, already snapping a picture before snorting at her own joke. The cafeteria seemed to hush for a moment, not silent but charged, the way people quiet down when they sense something cruel is happening. Heads turned. A couple of employees watched from the next table, their expressions uncertain, caught between amusement and discomfort. Grace didn't flinch. She didn't duck her head or gather her things to leave. Instead, she set her fork down gently and looked up, her brown eyes steady as they met Samantha's. "It's just food," she said softly. The words weren't defensive, they weren't bitter, they were simple, almost tender, but in a way that left Samantha blinking, her smile faltering for a split second before she tossed her hair and walked off. The laughter followed her out, sharp but already fading. Grace picked up her fork again and ate the rest of her lunch, her movements calm, as if she had been through this many times before. Still, the sting lingered. She could feel the heat of the glances, the way the room seemed to mark her as different. She reached up and brushed her fingers lightly over the silver locket at her neck, its cool weight pressing against her skin. She remembered the words Lucas had once whispered when he gave it to her years ago. "You are simple, yes, but never small." No one in that cafeteria knew who she really was. To them, she was just a quiet assistant, with a thrift store blouse and a tired lunchbox. But Grace knew something they didn't. Silence, carried with dignity, was far stronger than cruelty dressed in noise. By the next morning, the cafeteria scene had already turned into office gossip. The whispers carried from cubicle to cubicle, slipping through the hum of ringing phones and clicking keyboards. Grace could feel them at her back as she walked the carpeted hallway, short laughs muffled behind coffee cups, smirks that disappeared when she turned her head. "School, Mum," someone muttered just loud enough for others to hear. Another voice chimed in. "Bet she shops in the clearance section." A round of chuckles followed, low but sharp. Grace didn't break stride. Her flat shoes made no sound as she crossed the floor, her tote swinging softly at her side. She went straight to her desk in the corner, the one no one else wanted because of the flickering light above it. She set down her lunch, straightened her files, and powered on her computer. Her expression stayed calm, her posture steady, as if she hadn't heard a word. Later that week, she stood at the printer, waiting as the machine spit out page after page of a contract she had spent hours reviewing. Vanessa from sales drifted by, her bright scarf catching the light. She paused, her voice pitched high enough for everyone nearby. "Look at her," Vanessa said, tilting her head toward Grace. "Still printing her own documents like she's a temp? Probably just polishing up a resume for some call centre." The group behind her laughed, one man nudging another as if the joke was too good to miss. A crumpled sheet of scrap paper rolled across the desk toward Grace, not thrown directly at her but close enough to sting. Grace reached for the pages, her hand pausing for a moment on the smooth stack. Then she turned, calm as ever, and picked up the paper ball. She straightened and held it out toward Vanessa, her voice even. "Is this yours?" Vanessa waved her manicured hand, dismissive. "Keep it. Matches your vibe." The laughter grew louder, bouncing off the cubicle walls. Grace didn't respond. She set the ball neatly on the pile of finished contracts, aligned the edges, and walked away with steady steps. The locket at her neck caught the fluorescent glow, a brief flash of silver in the dull grey office. Back at her desk, she slid the papers into a folder and clicked open a spreadsheet, her focus unshaken. Her contracts were flawless, her reports precise. For every cruel word thrown her way, she built a wall of steady, meticulous work that no one could fault. They thought she was invisible. What they didn't see was that her silence wasn't weakness, it was her choice. And one day, that choice would matter more than all their words. One grey morning, Grace arrived before most of the office. She liked those quiet minutes, when the only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights and the shuffle of papers. At her desk, she unpacked her sandwich into its worn container, smoothed out a contract draft and placed her locket gently on top, as if its weight steadied her hands. By mid-morning, the floor was buzzing again. Grace stood by the coffee machine, her tote slung over one shoulder, waiting as her cup filled slowly. Beside her, a young analyst named Tim shifted nervously, his fingers tapping against his paper cup. His eyes darted toward her tote, then back to her face. "Excuse me," he said softly, almost as if he wasn't sure he should. "You're Grace Miller, right?" Grace turned, her brown eyes calm, her smile faint but warm. "Just Grace," she replied. Tim hesitated, his voice dropping lower. "I think I saw your name once. In the archive files. On some of the company's first contracts." His brows furrowed, like he was piecing together a puzzle. Before Grace could respond, laughter rang out from down the hall. Samantha's sharp voice carried into the break room, followed by her friend's chatter. Tim stiffened. His shoulders tensed, and he quickly lowered his cup, pretending to check his phone instead. Grace didn't press him. She capped her bottle and nodded gently. "Have a good morning," she said, her voice quiet but steady. She walked out with her tote brushing against her leg, leaving Tim standing in the doorway. He stayed frozen for a moment, the words still on his tongue but unsaid. He wanted to ask, wanted to know more, but he wasn't brave enough to stand apart from the crowd, not yet. Back at her desk, Grace opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. Between the papers was a small photo. Her and Lucas, years ago, sitting in a diner booth, their hands smudged with ink as they scribbled contract terms on napkins. She stared at it for a moment, her face softening, before sliding it back inside and closing the drawer. Outside her corner cubicle, the whispers continued, sharper now. "She doesn't belong here. Looks like she shops at thrift stores." The laughter trailed past her desk like shadows. Grace adjusted her files, brushed her fingers over the silver locket at her neck, and kept working. They thought she was invisible. They thought she was ordinary. What they didn't realise was that her silence was not weakness, it was a choice. And that choice was stronger than they could ever imagine. The hum of the printer filled the far end of the office, spitting out page after page of a contract Grace had reviewed with her usual care. She stood patiently, her hands folded in front of her, waiting for the stack to finish. The smell of warm ink lingered in the air. Vanessa appeared with two of her sales teammates, her bright scarf swinging as she stopped by the machine. She gave Grace a once-over, her lips curling into that familiar smirk. Without asking, she slipped her flash drive into the printer, cancelling Grace's job midstream. The screen blinked, and her carefully cued pages disappeared. "Oh, sorry," Vanessa said, her tone dripping with mock sweetness. "Didn't realise you were still using it, but, don't temps usually wait until the real employees are done?" Her teammates laughed. One leaned over, snatching a half-printed page from the tray and holding it up like evidence. "Looks like she's playing Office. Should we check if it's real work or just recipes?" The laughter swelled. Vanessa tapped at the printer again, frowning theatrically. Guess I jammed it. You don't mind fixing it, right? You seem like the type who's good with simple tasks." Grace stayed very still. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her tote, but her face didn't change. She reached out calmly, removed the crumpled paper from the tray, and pressed a single button. The machine whirred, cleared itself, and resumed printing as if nothing had happened. She gathered her pages slowly, stacking them neatly before turning to face Vanessa. Her brown eyes met Vanessa's without flinching. "I'm here to work," Grace said quietly. The words weren't sharp, but they carried weight, the kind that cut deeper than sarcasm. For a moment, Vanessa faltered, her smirk flickering, before she waved her hand and laughed again, leading her teammates away. Grace walked back to her desk, her stack of contracts held close, the locket at her neck catching the fluorescent glow. She set the papers down, her movements precise, and returned to her chair. Around her, the noise of the office rose again, but she stayed steady, her silence louder than their jeers. The break room buzzed with the low hum of the vending machine and the faint smell of burnt coffee. Grace stood at the counter, refilling her plain plastic bottle from the water dispenser. The bottle was scratched from years of use, but it worked just fine. She preferred it that way, simple, reliable, hers. The door swung open. Samantha walked in with Lisa close behind, both carrying their designer mugs, their laughter filling the room before they even noticed Grace. Samantha's eyes landed on the bottle immediately. She picked it up from the counter, holding it between two manicured fingers, as if it was something she'd found on the sidewalk. "Wow," Samantha said, her smile sharp. "Still reusing this old thing? What is this, a high school gym bottle?" Lisa giggled, pulling out her phone like she always did. "Careful, Sam, it might be vintage. Maybe we should post it. Hash thrifty queen." The two of them laughed, Lisa pretending to snap a picture. Then Samantha tossed the bottle back toward Grace. It slipped in Grace's hands, water splashing across the front of her blouse, leaving a cold stain that spread quickly across the fabric. For a moment, the room stilled. Grace's jaw tightened, but her hands stayed steady. She reached for a napkin from the counter and dabbed at the spot, calm, precise, refusing to give them the satisfaction of panic. She looked up, her brown eyes meeting Samantha's without a tremor. "It's just water," she said softly. The words hung in the air, quiet but heavy. Lisa's laughter faltered. Samantha's smirk twitched before she rolled her eyes and turned away, waving off the moment as if it meant nothing. "Keep saving those pennies," she muttered, brushing past Grace toward the door. Their voices trailed down the hallway, sharp and hollow. Grace folded the damp napkin neatly, set it aside, and tightened the cap on her bottle. She brushed her fingers against the locket at her neck, its silver surface cool against her skin, and drew a long breath. The blouse would dry, the stain would fade. What mattered was that she hadn't. The afternoon felt like any other. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, voices rising and falling across the rows of cubicles. Grace sat at her desk, her head bent over a stack of vendor contracts. She read each line with the patience of someone who understood that details mattered. To her, this wasn't busy work, it was the foundation of trust. Then the office shifted, a new email landed in every inbox, the familiar chime cutting through the noise. People glanced at their screens, and within seconds the buzz began. It was from Mr. Carver, one of the most senior executives in the company, a man whose name rarely appeared outside board meetings. His message was short but powerful. Special recognition to Grace Miller for identifying a $250,000 error in a vendor agreement. Her diligence sets a standard for us all. The floor grew still for a beat. Dozens of eyes flicked toward Grace's corner desk, some surprised, others suspicious. Then came the whispers. "Lucky catch," Samantha muttered as she walked past with her latte, her voice loud enough for half the office. "Even blind squirrels find acorns." Lisa leaned across her cubicle wall, smirking, probably calmer for those sad little salads she eats every day. A few chuckles followed, quick and shallow. Grace's hand paused on a folder. A faint crease formed between her brows, but only for a moment. She adjusted the papers, brushed her fingers across the locket at her neck, and continued her work. Her pen moved steadily, her posture calm. She didn't open the email again. She didn't linger on the recognition or the whispers that tried to bury it. For her, it wasn't about attention. It was about the work itself, about catching what others missed, about honouring the promise she and Lucas had made long ago when the company was just an idea scribbled on diner napkins. Details matter because people matter. The noise in the office returned, sharper now with the sting of jealousy. But at her corner desk, Grace stayed quiet. Her silence wasn't retreat, it was strength, the kind that unsettled those who had never learned to carry it. The lobby was alive with noise that morning. Employees clustered in small groups, rehearsing for the annual conference. The marble floor echoed with polished shoes, voices sharp and eager. Grace stood near the back, clipboard in hand, quietly checking schedules while others rushed around her without a second glance. From across the room, Jared leaned against a pillar, his tie loose, his grin wide. Egged on by his friends, he straightened and sauntered toward her, his voice pitched to Carrie. "Let's see what Miss Modest hides under that thrift store skirt," he sneered, and in one quick tug, he yanked the fabric upward. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The skirt flew up, gasps and muffled laughter colliding in the air. A few phones were raised, recording. Grace's face flushed, but her hands moved quickly. She smoothed the skirt back down, lifted her chin, and locked eyes with Jared. Her brown eyes were sharp, steady as glass. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice low but cutting through the lobby like a blade. The room fell silent. A few people shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting away. Others snickered under their breath, unwilling to stand apart from the crowd. Near the reception desk, an HR representative froze with her phone in hand, her expression unreadable. She glanced toward Jared, then toward Grace, but said nothing. The silence of authority was almost louder than the laughter had been. Grace turned without another word. Her flat shoes scuffed softly against the marble as she walked toward the elevators. Her tote swung at her side, the silver locket at her neck catching the light. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble. Each step was steady, deliberate, though her hand trembled slightly against the clipboard she held. As the elevator doors closed, the murmur of gossip erupted again. "She didn't even fight back," someone whispered. "Weird," another said, though his voice lacked conviction. Jared's friends tried to laugh it off, but their chuckles sounded thin, almost forced. Inside the elevator, Grace let herself exhale. She pressed her palm to the locket, feeling its cool surface ground her. Lucas's voice echoed in her memory. "You don't have to shout to be strong. Sometimes silence is the loudest answer." And that morning, her silence was already roaring louder than the cruelty that tried to break her. By the next morning, the lobby incident had already spread like wildfire. Shaky clips recorded on phones were passed around in group chats, whispered about near the elevators, replayed with smirks by people huddled over screens. Some laughed, some shook their heads, but everyone was talking about Grace. "She didn't even scream," one man muttered by the coffee station. "Strange, right?" another replied. "Like she didn't care." Samantha strutted past a row of cubicles, her heels clicking against the floor. "If she had any self-respect, she'd resign today," she announced, tossing her hair. Lisa trailed behind, smirking, her phone glowing in her hand. "By lunch, she'll be gone. Just watch." Their laughter lingered like perfume, sharp and suffocating. Grace walked the hallway with her tote close to her side, her blouse freshly pressed, her steps unhurried. She passed them without a word, her gaze steady, her silence a shield. To anyone watching closely, her fingers pressed against the strap of her tote just a little tighter than usual. At the reception desk, Alison kept her eyes on Grace as she stepped into the elevator. The night before, Alison had been helping archive old directories. That's where she'd seen it, Grace Miller, listed among the early consultants who had shaped the company's first agreements. She remembered the name clearly, etched into the foundation of everything these people now took for granted. "That's her," Alison whispered to the colleague beside her, her voice trembling. "I swear that's the same name from the founding records." Her colleague scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Come on, look at her. She's just an assistant." But Alison didn't answer. She kept watching as the elevator doors closed, her hand tightening around the phone on her desk. She wasn't certain of much, but she was certain there was more to Grace than the others believed. Upstairs, Grace returned to her desk. She stacked her contracts neatly, opened her files and let her pen glide across the page. Around her, the whispers grew louder, glances sharper, but she didn't lift her head. She touched the silver locket at her neck, breathing slow and steady. The office thought they had broken her. What they didn't see was that their cruelty had only thinned the air, making room for the truth to break through. The office felt heavy that morning, like the air before a summer storm. Conversations were shorter, eyes restless. A company-wide memo had gone out before dawn. The global chairman was flying in to address a serious matter of ethics. No one said it out loud, but glances slid again and again toward Grace's corner desk. Near the coffee machine, Jared lounged with his usual swagger. "She's done," he said, stirring his cup with a grin. "By lunchtime she'll be out the door with that sad little tote of hers." His friends laughed, relieved by his certainty. Grace didn't react. She sat at her desk, her papers in order, her pen moving slowly across the page. The silver locket at her neck glinted each time she shifted, catching the light like a quiet answer no one understood. Then the building shifted. The glass doors of the lobby swung open and a line of sleek black cars pulled to the curb outside. The hum of chatter died almost instantly. People leaned forward, craning their necks. Lucas Miller stepped inside. Tall, composed, his dark suit pressed, his expression unreadable. He didn't hurry. Each step across the marble was steady, deliberate, echoing louder than the dozens of hushed breaths around him. Phones slipped into pockets. Coffee cups froze mid-air. Samantha clutched her bag tighter, her smirk thinning. Lisa lowered her phone, her screen suddenly dark. Even Jared's grin faltered. Lucas's gaze scanned the room once, sharp and searching, until it landed on Grace. She hadn't moved from her desk. She sat quietly, her tote at her side, her blouse still damp from the water stain that hadn't quite faded. When their eyes met, Grace rose slowly to her feet. She didn't smile, didn't speak. Her fingers brushed the locket at her neck as if to ground herself. Lucas walked to her with calm certainty. The office watched, breathless, the only sound his shoes striking the marble. He reached her desk, paused, and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. The silence that followed was so complete it was almost unbearable. Only then did he speak, his voice even but carrying through every corner of the room. "This is my wife." The words crashed through the silence like thunder. Samantha's bag slipped from her arm and hit the floor. Jared's cup rattled against the counter. Lisa's hand froze over her phone. Grace stood steady, her posture quiet but unshakable. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't defended herself. But in that moment, every cruel whisper in the office was silenced. The silence after Lucas spoke stretched long and heavy. "This is my wife." The words echoed in the air, steady and undeniable. Eyes widened, glances ricocheted from Grace to Lucas and back again. Lucas didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Grace Miller," he said clearly, "co-founder of this company, principal shareholder, the mind behind contracts that built our foundation." His tone was even, almost calm, but it carried a finality that left no space for doubt. The ripple of shock was immediate. Samantha's face drained of colour, her bag still lying forgotten on the floor. Lisa's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto her desk. Jared stood frozen near the coffee machine, his swagger gone, his smirk hollow. Grace stood beside Lucas, her beige skirt and simple blouse unchanged, but suddenly commanding every eye in the room. She didn't gloat. She didn't glare. She simply lifted her chin, her silence heavier than any accusation could have been. Lucas turned to her, his hand brushing hers briefly. Then, with the same calm authority, he handed her a folder. "The board is waiting," he said softly. Grace took it with steady hands and walked toward the conference room. The crowd parted instinctively, the hush of their shame following her steps. By noon, the fallout had already begun. An email circulated across the company. Samantha, Lisa, and Jared were suspended pending an ethics investigation. Clips of their mockery spread online, not as jokes, but as evidence of cruelty. Comments poured in, not laughter this time, but anger. The reputations they had flaunted so proudly began to crumble. Grace, meanwhile, was appointed the company's first culture and compliance officer, tasked with ensuring respect across every level. She didn't move into a corner office. She kept her same tote bag, her same quiet routines, her same worn water bottle. Nothing about her needed changing. During new hire orientation weeks later, her story was told as company policy. Respect has no dress code. Her name became a reminder of integrity, not appearance. In her office drawer, she kept the same photo she once tucked away. A diner booth, a stack of napkins scribbled with ideas, Lucas's hands smudged with ink as they dreamed up the company together. It stayed there, a quiet anchor to remind her where she came from. Grace never asked for applause. She never needed revenge. Her silence had carried her through ridicule, humiliation, and doubt. And in the end, that silence spoke louder than cruelty ever could. For anyone who had ever been overlooked, laughed at, or dismissed, her story carried the same truth. You don't have to shout to prove your worth. Dignity speaks for itself. Never judge someone by their appearance or position. True strength is carried quietly, and dignity speaks louder than cruelty ever will. Thank you for listening all the way to this moment. I'm truly grateful for your time, and I wish you nothing but good fortune ahead. Before we close this story, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you again on Rain Inside.